Hello friends, let us discuss on women and environmental activism. With the growing environmental instability linked to the climate change, it is expected that the natural disasters will increase in frequency and their impacts. In the last few years, environmentalists and researchers have started collecting the information and data to create the documents on different impacts of natural disasters on women and men. For instance, during the natural disasters, women's economic insecurity tends to increase more than the men. Women often face gender specific barriers when dealing with relief and reconstruction work. The women's workload tend to increase more than men. Women tend to receive and larger impacts. They also tend to recover more slowly than in terms of economic losses than do the men because their socio-economic status is often more vulnerable at the times of disasters. The importance of understanding the different impacts of natural disasters on women, men, boys, and girls, it is slowly trickling into the mainstream disaster preparedness and response systems, as well as in the international relief efforts. We will have to consider the gender perspective in climate change. One of the most urgent environmental issues today is climate change all over the world. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported in early 2007 that global warming is unequivocal and that human activity is the main driver for it. However, there has been very little discussion on the gender dimensions of this threat and strategies to deal with the climate change. The poor are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Then the women, as a disproportionate percentage of the poor, are particularly more vulnerable. With increased environmental instability, women face particular strategies to protect the sustainability of their environmental and livelihoodness. For example, poor nomadic women may have a relatively high adaptive capacity because of their intimate knowledge of their natural environment. Environmental scientists have also pointed out that gender inequalities and roles are also relevant variables in tackling the climate change. There are gender differences in attitude and perceptions of climate change. We do not know enough about the gender aspects of climate change. Hence, more research and sex disaggregation of data is required for this purpose. In this regard, we have to see a little bit about the women's participation in decision making process at all levels. Despite the current rapid rate of progress in different fields, including the environmental protection, the women continue to be underrepresented in decision-making processes on the environment at all levels, that is, international, national, and local levels. Some of the reasons for this are their high illiteracy rates, limited access to natural resources, lack of information and training, stereotypical attitudes regarding their roles, as well as insufficient research on gender equality and the environment, lack of sex disaggregated data, and lack of potential commitments of political people. Women's limited participation in decision making process relate to almost all environmental sectors. The obstacles to their participation include the lack of the secure access to land, adverse financial conditions, women's time constraints, public policy traditionally focused on the male population as a head of household, and the gender division of labor along socio-cultural norms. The global scenario of progress on women's environmental decision making is very important. Despite the overall slow pace of change, some progress has been made in increasing women's participation in decision making related to the environment. Global attention to women's role in environmental protection, organizing the campaigning, and all the other activities jumped a notch with the awarding of 2004 Nobel Prize to Wangai Maathai, who was the founder of Green Belt movement. In year 2002, a network of women environmental ministers was formed with the participation of 22 female environment ministers and 28 women leaders of environment NGOs all over the world. In addition, there were specific examples of increased participation of women in water resource management at local levels. For example, in Nepal, a community water supply and sanitation program involves a women led sanitation team with the responsibility for 23 tap stands in 160 households. In Trinidad and Tobago, most of the community water projects have been started and run by the women. It means ensuring the attention to the gender perspective in disaster mitigation planning. It can be mitigated. In consequence of Asian tsunami, there is increase in global attention on early warning systems and mitigation plans to respond the natural disasters. These processes are not always accompanied by the concern for gender inequalities and generally doesn't include the gender analysis. Yet, the evidence of why the gender matters in natural disasters continues to count. Although the focus is often on women's vulnerability in disasters, there are critical links between gender equality, sustainable development, and the disaster reduction. These are women's roles long before and even longer after such occurrences. There are several critical themes to be considered in this respect. The understanding and supporting women's roles in resource conservation, supporting women's environmental activism, drawing on women's knowledge regarding vulnerabilities and coping strategies of specific groups within community, ensuring women's participation both as a community member and the expert in risk assessment and other emergency preparedness efforts, making women's work in disasters vulnerable in terms of family well-being and work through informal women's organizations, even supporting women's access to land, economic independence, reducing vulnerable against women, increasing the political participation, etc. Translating these general areas into a specific sector, entry points for improving work in flood mitigation have been identified. There are many areas in which we have to see the role of women as important with reference to climate change, which includes the areas, especially the flood areas where the mitigation problems are more, the identification of flood prone areas, the examination of livelihood systems in flood prone areas, especially the gender roles and responsibilities, and assessment of extent of type of damages caused due to flood, identification of different impacts of floods on women and men based on their specific roles and responsibilities. The development of mitigation strategies shall be targeted based on a gender perspective that goes beyond current community participation approaches. Therefore, it can change, it can take the change by incorporating gender equality issues in climate change programs. Only recently, it has been pointed out that the spotlight been shown on the gender dimensions of climate change. It means there are still many questions regarding both how the women and men will be affected differently by changing environmental patterns, and how the gender differences, roles, and inequalities will influence both the advocacy and consumption patterns, determining the future of this issue. Therefore, in nutshell, the gender equality, especially the role of women, need to be considered severely, and primarily we have to, when face the environmental disasters, in mitigation plans and many other decision making policies, we have to take the representation of women sufficiently so that the problem of climate change can be mitigated and the environmental activism will play a crucial role. Thank you very much.